On the morning of December 25th, 1941, a 56-year-old man in a civilian suit walked through the smoldering ruins of the American Pacific Fleet. He was not a hero. He was not famous. He was not even the man his president had wanted for the job. He was, by most accounts, not the first name Franklin Roosevelt considered. And in the next 3 years and 8 months, this measured Texan, a man most Americans have never heard of, would help destroy the most powerful naval empire in Asia, sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in 5 minutes, and starve an entire nation into surrender without ever raising his voice. This is the story of Chester W. Nimitz and the 3 decisions that changed the course of the 20th century. The smell hit him first. Before he saw the twisted steel, before he saw the oil-black water, before he saw the flag still flying above what had once been the mightiest naval base in the Pacific, he smelled it: burned rubber, scorched paint, the unmistakable, sickening sweetness of fuel oil mixed with something no sailor ever wants to name. Christmas Day, 1941. He had traveled halfway across the country in that plain civilian suit, avoiding attention, avoiding photographers, avoiding the questions that had no answers yet. He arrived at Pearl Harbor, not on a battleship, not with fanfare, not with the pageantry his rank and mission might have suggested. He arrived on the deck of a submarine, the USS Grayling. Because there were no battleships left to greet him. They were on the bottom. He stood in silence as the boat threaded its way through the wreckage. To his left, the shattered hull of the USS Arizona lay half submerged, her superstructure still smoking 18 days after the attack. More than 1,000 men were entombed inside her, sailors who had been eating breakfast on a Sunday morning, sailors who had been writing letters home, sailors who would never come home at all. To his right, the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma broke the surface like the back of a dead whale. The Utah lay on her side. The West Virginia rested on the harbor bottom, her decks awash. Everywhere he looked, he saw a navy that no longer existed. Take a moment to consider what he was seeing. 2,400 Americans were dead. 8 battleships had been sunk or crippled. Nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. In under 2 hours on the morning of December 7th, the most powerful naval installation in the Pacific had been gutted. And this graveyard was what he had come to command. He did not weep. He did not curse. He did not clench his jaw for the cameras. Those who watched him that day would later say the same thing. The new admiral simply looked, long, careful, absorbing, as if he were memorizing every detail so he could carry it with him for the rest of his life, because, in a sense, he would. Chester William Nimitz was 56 years old. He had been born in a small stone hotel in the German Texan town of Fredericksburg in the hill country west of Austin. His grandfather had been a merchant sea captain from Bremen who had settled in Texas and built a hotel shaped like a steamboat. His father had died before he was born. He grew up speaking German at home and English at school, a boy of the frontier who had never seen the ocean until he was almost a man. He had wanted to go to West Point. There were no slots available. So he went to Annapolis instead. He graduated in 1905, 7th in a class of 114. He was reserved, studious, disciplined, without being rigid. He specialized in something the Navy of that era barely understood, submarines. And later, in something even more obscure, diesel engines. He was not a carrier man. He was, in the eyes of the surface fleet, a technical officer, a useful specialist, not a warrior. He had run aground a destroyer as a young ensign and been court-martialed. He had lost part of a finger to a diesel engine during a test in 1914. He had spent decades learning the machinery of naval warfare from below, the engines, the fuel systems, the logistics, the coded signals, the men who made it all work. He was not glamorous. He was not famous. He was not the man anyone in America expected to lead the Pacific Fleet in her darkest hour. And here comes the first thing. History rarely tells you. Chester Nimitz was not Franklin Roosevelt's first choice. By some accounts, he was not his second choice either. In the frantic days after Pearl Harbor, the president had needed someone, anyone, to take command of the wreckage. The obvious names had all fallen away. Admiral James Richardson had already been dismissed the previous year for opposing Roosevelt's decision to base the fleet at Pearl. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander on the day of the attack, his career ending in disgrace. Others were considered. Others were passed over. Nimitz, the chief of the Bureau of Navigation, essentially the Navy's personnel officer, was, in the end, the man Roosevelt turned to. Not because he was the boldest, not because he was the most decorated, but because he was steady, because he understood the whole machine. Because in a moment when every part of the American war effort was on fire, the president needed a man who would not add to the flames. Nimitz himself was reluctant. He told his wife, Catherine, that he did not believe he was the right man for the job. She looked at him and told him, gently, that of course he was. And so, in mid-December of 1941, he boarded a train for the West Coast, still in civilian clothes, still trying to absorb the weight of what he was being asked to do. By December 25th, he was walking through the ruins. The formal change of command took place on December 31st, 1941. New Year's Eve, there was no ceremony aboard a great flagship. The Pennsylvania was in dry dock because the California was on the harbor bottom. The Arizona was a tomb, so they held the ceremony on the deck of a submarine. The USS Grayling, the same boat that had brought him in, served as his platform. Nimitz stood in his crisp white uniform, the Pacific sunlight catching his silver hair, and read the orders that placed him in command of what remained. Officers stood at attention on the narrow deck. The wreckage of the fleet stretched out behind them. It was, by any measure, the strangest change of command in the history of the United States Navy, and then Nimitz did something no one had expected. He kept the staff. Every senior officer who had served under Admiral Kimmel, the men who had been on watch during the disaster, the men whose careers were now under a shadow, the men everyone assumed the new commander would sweep away. Nimitz kept them all, everyone. He told them in a quiet room the morning after taking command that he had complete confidence in them, that he needed their experience. That the mistakes of December 7th had been the failures of a system, not of individuals, and that from this moment forward they would build something new together. It was one of the most consequential decisions of his career. It stopped the bleeding. It preserved institutional memory. It signaled to every officer in the Pacific that this new commander would not be a purger, would not be a politician, would not be a man who ruled by fear. Some in Washington muttered that he was being too soft, that he lacked killer instinct, that the Navy needed a butcher, not a bureaucrat. They were, all of them, wrong, because 6,000 miles away, in a nation intoxicated by 6 months of unbroken victory, another admiral was already planning the next blow, and this one he intended would finish the job. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. He was 57 years old. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had traveled across the United States by train from coast to coast, and he had seen the vast industrial power of American cities in a way that few of his countrymen ever had. He knew the country he was fighting. He knew what she could build. And he had told his own government before the war began that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that he had no confidence in ultimate victory. Now those 6 months were nearly up. Yamamoto commanded the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. 6 fleet carriers, hundreds of the most experienced naval aviators alive. 0 fighters that outclassed anything the Americans could put in the air. In the months since Pearl Harbor, this fleet had ravaged the Pacific. It had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya. It had struck as far west as Ceylon in the Indian Ocean, where its aircraft had savaged Royal Navy warships and shore installations. It had covered the Japanese conquest of the Philippines, of Malaya, of Singapore, of the Dutch East Indies, of Burma. An empire had been carved out of Asia in 6 months, and Yamamoto knew with the precision of a man who had counted the shipyards of California that he had one narrow window remaining before American industry made the war unwinnable. He needed to draw the American carriers. He needed to sink them, all of them. And he needed to do it before the summer of 1942. His plan was to threaten a small, sun-blasted atoll at the far northwest end of the Hawaiian chain, a place most Americans could not find on a map, a place called Midway. He calculated that the Americans would be forced to defend it, that they would send their remaining carriers, and that when they did, his overwhelming force would annihilate them. It was a good plan. It rested on one assumption, that the Americans would not know he was coming. That assumption was already, at that moment, being dismantled in a windowless basement beneath Naval headquarters at Pearl Harbor by a 42-year-old officer in slippers and a smoking jacket. A man who had not slept a full night in months. A man whose name in another era might have been forgotten entirely. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He ran a small, strange unit called Station Hypo. His team of cryptographers, mathematicians, linguists, and eccentrics worked around the clock in a converted basement, breathing stale air under fluorescent lights, chasing patterns in an endless river of intercepted Japanese radio traffic. They were trying to break a code, the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational cipher, a code called JN-25. They were succeeding. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team could read fragments of Japanese naval messages, sometimes 10%, sometimes 15%, occasionally more, enough to see shapes moving in the fog, enough to sense before the enemy struck where he might strike next. And by May of 1942, they were seeing something enormous, a massive Japanese operation being assembled. Carriers, battleships, transports, landing forces. All of it converging on a target designated only by 2 letters in the intercepts. AF. Rochefort was certain AF was Midway. But in Washington, the Navy's other code-breaking unit, OP-20G, run by 2 brothers named Raymond, was equally certain that AF was somewhere else, the Aleutians, the South Pacific, perhaps even the American West Coast. They dismissed Rochefort's analysis. They were senior. They were closer to the seat of power. They controlled the narrative that reached the desks of admirals, and Chester Nimitz, in his office at Pearl Harbor, had to choose. He could believe Washington, the safe choice, the institutionally protected choice, the choice that if wrong would cost him nothing personally. Or he could believe a lieutenant commander in a smoking jacket in a basement, a man Washington was actively trying to discredit, and stake the last 3 American aircraft carriers in the Pacific on his word. Nimitz asked Rochefort a single question. Was he sure? Rochefort said he was sure. Nimitz believed him. To confirm it, Rochefort devised a trick that would go down in the history of intelligence warfare. He arranged for Midway to send a plain language radio message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Within 48 hours, Japanese naval intercepts were reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was sprung. AF was Midway. The date of the attack would be the first week of June. Nimitz now had something Isoroku Yamamoto had never imagined he would possess. Time. He moved fast. The carrier Yorktown, badly damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was limping into Pearl Harbor with a gash in her side and flooded compartments below. Naval engineers estimated repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. 1,400 workers descended on the wounded carrier in shifts around the clock. Welders, riveters, electricians, pipe fitters. They worked in the heat of the Hawaiian sun and under floodlights through the tropical night. They ate at their stations. They slept in short bursts on steel decking, and on the morning of May 30th, 1942, the USS Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join the Enterprise and the Hornet at a rendezvous point northeast of Midway that the Americans, with a note of dark humor, had named Point Luck. Below her decks, welding crews were still working. Nimitz stood at his office window as she departed. Behind him on his desk was a single sheet of paper. On it, in his own handwriting, were the orders he had issued to his task force commanders, orders that would shape everything that followed. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk. 5 words. That was the doctrine. That was the philosophy. That was the mind of Chester Nimitz, distilled to its essence, not reckless boldness. R, not passive defense, calculated risk. 6,000 miles to the west, Isoroku Yamamoto was boarding the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, to sail east and finish the war. He did not know that his codes had been broken. He did not know that his target had been identified. He did not know that a submarine officer from a Texas hill town had already positioned 3 aircraft carriers at exactly the point in the ocean where his own attack plan required them not to be. He did not know that the trap was already closed. He was sailing into it. The dawn came up gray and cold over an empty ocean. June 4th, 1942. R. The men aboard the American carriers had been at battle stations for hours, standing in the half-light with coffee going cold in their hands, waiting for the war to find them. They knew it was coming. They did not know exactly when. They did not know exactly how. But they knew, because Chester Nimitz had told them, that this was the day. 200 miles to the northwest, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier, Akagi. He was 54 years old. He had been the commander of the Kido Butai at Pearl Harbor. He had led it in triumph across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. R. He was a torpedo officer by training, a surface warfare man, and in the intimate councils of the Imperial Japanese Navy, there were those who whispered that he had never truly understood carriers, that he was a caretaker of a weapon he did not fully believe in. At 4:30 in the morning, he launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. They lifted off from the 4 carrier decks, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and turned east toward the tiny American island that lay somewhere beyond the horizon. Everything at that moment was proceeding exactly as Rochefort had predicted. The first American attacks came from Midway itself. Marine dive bombers, Army B-17s, torpedo planes so obsolete that their pilots knew, taking off, that most of them would not come back. R. They pressed home their attacks with a courage that broke the heart of every officer who watched them. And they achieved nothing. They scored no hits. They lost most of their number to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But they forced Nagumo to make a decision. His returning aircraft from the Midway strike would need to land soon. His reserve force, armed with torpedoes for use against enemy ships, sat on his flight decks. R, a scout plane, had just reported belatedly that American warships were in the area. He needed to know what kind. He needed to decide whether to strike them or to complete the destruction of Midway. He hesitated. He ordered his reserve force rearmed, torpedoes swapped out for bombs, to finish Midway, then reversed himself when the scout reported at least 1 American aircraft carrier in the sighting. Bombs off, torpedoes back on. Ordnance carts rolling across crowded flight decks. Fuel hoses snaking between aircraft. Live weapons stacked where they should never have been stacked because there was no time to strike them below. It was in this moment, this narrow window of confusion, of fuel, of exposed ordnance, that the American torpedo squadrons found him. Squadron 8 came in first. 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet. Slow, underpowered, flying without fighter escort because their fighters had gotten lost in the vastness of the ocean. They came in low, at wave-top height, straight into the guns of the Kido Butai. Every single aircraft was shot down. Of the 30 men who flew Torpedo 8 that morning, 29 died in the water within minutes. 1 survived. His name was Ensign George Gay. R. He clung to a seat cushion hidden under it and watched the rest of the battle unfold above his head. Somewhere in Texas, that same week, his mother would receive a telegram from the War Department. It would tell her that her son was missing in action. It would be many days before she learned he was alive. The only one of 30. Think about that for a moment. 29 mothers received the same telegram. 29 wives. 29 sweethearts. 29 families walked to their mailboxes that summer, and their world stopped. Torpedo Squadron 6 came next from the Enterprise. 10 of 14 shot down. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. 10 of 12 shot down. No hits, no damage, just young men in the ocean and their aircraft burning on the surface. The Japanese pilots and anti-aircraft crews were exultant. The Americans were being slaughtered, but something else was happening. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters that defended the fleet, had been dragged down to wave-top height to kill the torpedo planes. And at that moment, 20,000 feet above them, unnoticed, unopposed, nearly 50 American dive bombers arrived overhead. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese fleet on a fuel-critical mission. He had been about to turn back. Instead, on a hunch, he followed a lone Japanese destroyer he saw racing north across the empty sea. That destroyer led him to the carriers. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading the Yorktown dive bombers, arrived over the same target at the same moment from a different angle. At 22 minutes past 10 in the morning, they pushed over into their dives. What followed lasted 5 minutes. The Akagi, Nagumo's own flagship, took a single bomb near the middle elevator that ignited the fueled and armed aircraft on her hangar deck. Within seconds, she was an inferno. The Kaga took 4 bombs, one in the bridge that killed her entire command staff. She began to burn from stem to stern. The Soryu took 3 bombs and became, within 20 minutes, an unmanageable furnace. 3 carriers, 5 minutes. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, escaped the initial strike and launched her own counterattack, savaging the Yorktown so badly she would eventually be sunk. But by late afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu too. She took 4 bombs. She burned all night. In the darkness before dawn, her crew scuttled her. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in a single day. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors died. Over 100 of the most experienced naval aviators in the world went into the Pacific and never came out. The core of the Kido Butai, the fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ravaged the Indian Ocean, that had seemed for 6 months to be invincible, was destroyed. And here was the twist that few outside the fleet ever understood. The American commander who directed that battle at sea, from the bridge of the cruiser Astoria to the deck of the carrier Enterprise, was not William Halsey. Halsey, the man Nimitz had trusted most, the aggressive carrier admiral everyone expected to lead the fleet into battle, was in a hospital bed at Pearl Harbor, suffering from a severe skin condition brought on by stress and exhaustion. In his place, at Halsey's own recommendation, Nimitz had appointed a 55-year-old admiral named Raymond Spruance, a cruiser man, a surface officer, a man who had never commanded aircraft carriers in combat in his life. Spruance did not fit the picture of a warrior. He was reserved, cerebral, sparse in his words. He walked long distances alone to think. Some of his own staff worried that Nimitz had made a catastrophic error. At Midway, Spruance ran the battle with the precision of a mathematician. When his aviators wanted to press on into the night and hunt the surviving Japanese battleships, he refused. He turned east. He would be criticized for it. In the days that followed, he would be vindicated by history for the rest of time. Chester Nimitz had picked him, just as Nimitz had picked Rochefort. Just as Nimitz had picked the 72-hour repair of the Yorktown, just as Nimitz had picked Point Luck. Every one of those calculated risks had come home. But Midway was only the first move. In the months that followed, the strategic momentum in the Pacific began slowly to shift. Japan still held an empire. She still held the Philippines. She still held the Dutch East Indies. She still held island fortresses stretching across a quarter of the surface of the earth. And between the American Navy and the home islands of Japan lay a nightmare of geography. 100 of atolls, coral reefs, jungle strongholds, each one garrisoned by soldiers who had shown, from Wake Island to Bataan, that they would fight to the last man. If the United States tried to take every one of those islands in sequence, the war would grind on into the 1950s. Hundreds of thousands of Americans would die. Millions of Japanese would die, and the American public would eventually lose the will to continue. Nimitz refused to fight that war. He devised something different, something quieter than a battle, a doctrine. He would not take every island. He would take the ones that mattered. The rest, even the strongest, even the most heavily garrisoned, he would bypass. He would leave them cut off. He would let the ocean around them become an American lake. And the Japanese soldiers on those forgotten islands, denied food, denied ammunition, denied evacuation, would, in Nimitz's own phrase, wither on the vine. It was a doctrine of cold arithmetic. It was also a doctrine of mercy, though few would have recognized it as such at the time. Every island bypassed was a battle not fought. Every battle not fought it was a veterans who would live to see their children grow up. It was called island hopping, and it enraged General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, commanding in the Southwest Pacific, believed the road to Tokyo lay through New Guinea and the Philippines. He had left Manila under humiliating circumstances in 1942 with a promise, "I shall return." That had become a personal covenant. He would not permit any strategy that bypassed the islands where American troops had been left to die. Nimitz believed the road to Tokyo lay through the Central Pacific, directly across the ocean, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Bonins, straight into the heart of the Japanese home waters. Two theaters, two commanders, two entirely opposed strategies, and in Washington, a war effort being pulled in two directions simultaneously. In July of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt himself flew to Hawaii to settle the argument. He met MacArthur and Nimitz at a beachside villa in Waikiki. He listened for hours to both men present their cases, and then he did something no one had expected. He did not choose. He approved both strategies simultaneously, in parallel. MacArthur would drive north through New Guinea and reclaim the Philippines. Nimitz would strike west across the Central Pacific. Japan, already stretched thin, would now be forced to defend against two overwhelming offensives at once. It was, on paper, an impossible way to fight a war. It doubled the logistical burden. It divided command. It went against every principle of concentration of force taught in every war college in the world. It also worked, because Nimitz's central drive had a secret weapon that made the impossible practical, the fleet train. A vast, unglamorous fleet of oilers, tenders, repair ships, ammunition ships, refrigerated stores, floating dry docks, and an entire mobile logistics infrastructure that traveled with the combat fleet and allowed it to remain at sea for months at a time. No navy in the history of the world had ever done anything on that scale. Nimitz built it, and with it he began to bypass. In February of 1944, he set his sights on the greatest of all the Japanese fortresses in the Central Pacific, Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, a vast lagoon ringed by coral, filled with Japanese warships, ringed by airfields, defended by tens of thousands of troops. The Americans called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Every pre-war naval study had assumed that any advance across the Central Pacific would have to take Truk. It was inconceivable to leave a base of that strength intact. Nimitz left it intact. He sent Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher to conduct a 2-day carrier airstrike called Operation Hailstone. The strike destroyed over 250 Japanese aircraft. It sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and over 30 merchant and supply ships. It gutted Truk's ability to project power, and then Nimitz simply sailed around it. Truk sat there for the rest of the war, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, trapped, useless, consuming their own stockpiles, fishing in the lagoon to stay alive. They were still there, hungry and forgotten, on the day their emperor announced the surrender. The same logic was applied to Rabaul, to Kavieng, to dozens of other strongholds. The Japanese had built a wall of steel and coral across the Pacific. Nimitz walked around it. But even now, we are not at the deepest move, because the third of Nimitz's great strategic decisions, the one that no camera ever filmed, the one that no newsreel ever celebrated, the one that Americans then and now know almost nothing about, was already killing an empire from beneath the waves. Japan, in 1941, was one of the most resource-dependent industrial powers in the world. She had no domestic oil. She had almost no iron ore. She could not feed her own population without imports. Every drop of fuel that powered her warships had come, ultimately, from the Dutch East Indies. Every ton of rubber came from Malaya. Every ingot of steel began somewhere else. Her empire existed only so long as her merchant ships could carry those raw materials across thousands of miles of open ocean. Cut those shipping lanes, and Japan would suffocate. Chester Nimitz had once been a submarine officer. He had commanded them as a young man. He had lived inside them. He understood their strengths and their brutal limitations more deeply than any senior officer in the United States Navy. And from the first weeks of his command, he made unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping a strategic priority. And immediately, he ran into a wall. Because the torpedoes did not work. The American submarine force in 1942 was armed almost exclusively with the Mark 14 torpedo. It had been designed in the interwar years and never, not once, properly tested with live warheads. It cost the equivalent of a small house to build, and in combat it was catastrophic. It ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath its targets. Its magnetic detonators fired prematurely or not at all. Its contact detonators, when submarines finally began setting them to run shallow, crumpled on impact without exploding. Submarine skippers came home from war patrols with stories of perfect firing solutions, of torpedoes running true, of enemy ships steaming on unharmed. They filed report after report. They pleaded for investigation. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refused to believe them. Buord insisted that the torpedoes were fine. That the fault must lie with the submarine crews, that the captains were misjudging their firing angles, that the enlisted torpedomen were setting depths incorrectly. Careers were quietly damaged. Skippers were relieved for lack of aggression when, in fact, they had been doing everything right and being betrayed by their own weapons. For 20 months, this went on. 20 months in which Japanese oil tankers steamed across the Pacific untouched, in which the war effort was silently sabotaged from within, in which the Navy's own bureaucracy refused to acknowledge the truth. It was ended by a single admiral. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding the submarine force in the Southwest Pacific, decided that if Washington would not test the torpedoes, he would. He rigged fishing nets in the deep water off the Australian coast. He fired live torpedoes at them. He counted holes. He proved with iron in his hands that the Mark 14 was running an average of 10 feet deeper than set. He proved that the magnetic detonator was worthless. He proved that the contact detonator broke on impact instead of firing. He sent his findings to Nimitz. Nimitz used them to break Buord. By the summer of 1943, the torpedoes were finally working, and the American submarine force, freed at last to fight the war it had been built to fight, began to strangle Japan. By the end of 1944, our American submarines had sunk more than 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, over 5 million tons of shipping, 60% of the entire Japanese merchant marine. Oil deliveries from the Dutch East Indies slowed to a trickle. Warships at anchor could not fuel to sortie. Aircraft sat on runways without gasoline. Factories in the home islands went idle. Rice from Formosa rotted on docks that had no ships to move it. And beyond the tonnage, the submarines did something else. They saw for the fleet. Submarine sightings gave Nimitz timely intelligence on Japanese naval movements that shaped every major carrier engagement of the later war. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, submarine contacts warned of the approaching Japanese fleet in time to prepare an ambush that ended with 3 enemy carriers on the bottom. At Leyte Gulf in October, American submarines sank 2 heavy cruisers, including a Japanese flagship, before the main surface engagement had even begun, and they saved American lives. Positioned near Japanese-held islands during carrier strikes, submarines pulled shot-down aviators out of the water, hundreds of them, over the course of the war. Young men whose training had cost the Navy a fortune, whose lives could not be replaced, who were fished from the sea and returned to their squadrons to fly again. One of them, plucked from the water by the submarine USS Finback near the island of Chichijima on September 1944, was a 20-year-old Navy pilot named George Herbert Walker Bush. 44 years later, he would take the oath of office as the 41st President of the United States, and Chester Nimitz never spoke publicly about the submarine campaign the way he's spoke about Midway or the great carrier battles. It did not photograph well. It was not the stuff of newsreels. It was a war of dark water and steel cylinders and men who volunteered month after month for the highest casualty rate in the American armed forces. 1 in 5 American submariners who went out on war patrol did not come back. They knew it. They went anyway. And by the summer of 1945, because of them and because of the man who had backed them from Pearl Harbor from the very first weeks of the war, the empire that had once seemed unstoppable was starving on its own islands. By the summer of 1945, Japan was already dying, not from bombs, not yet from atoms, from something slower, something quieter. Something that had begun in the basement of a naval headquarters in Hawaii and in the crowded ordnance rooms of submarines and on the flight decks of carriers that had once been welded back together in 72 hours. The empire that had once stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomons, from Burma to Wake Island, had been reduced to the home islands themselves. And even those islands, ringed by sea, cut off from the resources that had built them, were slowly running out of everything. Fuel oil reserves had fallen below 2 months of even peacetime consumption. The mighty battleship Yamamoto, sister of the Musashi and the largest warship ever built, had sailed on her final mission in April with only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. She had been sunk south of Kyushu by American carrier aircraft, taking more than 3,000 men to the bottom in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the fleet that had once been the 3rd largest in the world, the fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor, the fleet that had swept British warships from the Indian Ocean, no longer existed as a fighting force. Her surviving warships lay at anchor in inland seas, camouflaged with nets, unable to sortie for lack of fuel. Merchant shipping was down to a fraction of pre-war tonnage. Rice from Formosa could not reach the home islands. Coal from Manchuria sat on docks with no ships to move it. In Tokyo and Osaka and every industrial city not yet burned out by the American bombing campaign, factories stood silent because the raw materials they needed no longer arrived. And this was before Hiroshima. This was before Nagasaki. There is a report filed in 1946 called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. It was written by American analysts sent into the ruins of Japan after the surrender to determine what had actually caused the collapse of the empire. They interviewed Japanese officers. They examined Japanese records. They walked through the burned factories and the empty ports. Their conclusion, published on paper that few Americans have ever read, was as unsparing as it was measured. In the judgment of that survey, Japan would likely have been forced to surrender in 1945, even without the atomic bombs, even without a Soviet declaration of war, even without an invasion of the home islands, because she could no longer feed her people, fuel her machines, or arm her defenders. She had been strangled by the sea. Historians still debate the weight to give that conclusion. Reasonable men disagree. The bombs were dropped. The war ended, and no one can say with certainty what would have happened in a world where they had not been. But this much is not in dispute. The 3 moves that Chester Nimitz had made, the intelligence gamble at Midway, the doctrine of bypass and isolation, the long, silent war of the submarines, had done what no landing force and no bomber fleet ever quite finished. They had broken the material foundation of the empire. They had made the end inevitable, only the timing remained in doubt. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, under a low gray sky, the battleship USS Missouri lay at anchor around her in every direction. The fleet stretched to the horizon: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, the largest concentration of naval power in the history of the world. Almost none of it had existed on the day Chester Nimitz took command of the wreckage at Pearl Harbor 3 years and 8 months earlier. Look at those men in the photographs from the Missouri deck that morning. Look at their faces. This was the America that built Liberty ships in 4 days. The America that trained 60,000 pilots in a matter of years. The America that turned a country of car dealers and farmers into the greatest naval power in the history of the world in less time than it takes today to design a single aircraft carrier. That America was not louder than we are. It was steadier. It got the job done. Nimitz stood on the veranda deck in his dress whites, silver hair still catching the morning light as it had on the deck of a submarine on the last day of 1941. He was 59 years old. He had commanded, at his peak, more than 2 million men and more than 6,000 ships. He would, in a few minutes, sign for the United States of America the document that ended the deadliest war in human history. General Douglas MacArthur presided. It was, in the end, his moment. He had come to Tokyo Bay by way of Corregidor and Bataan, by way of Buna and Leyte, by way of the personal covenant he had made when he left Manila under fire in 1942. He read a short speech. He was, as always, magnificent on the stage, and then he stepped aside and Nimitz walked forward. He carried a plain pen. He signed his name. There was no gesture. There was no flourish. He signed the way he had done every important thing in his career, carefully, precisely, without waste, and he stepped back. Somewhere in the fleet spread around him on the deck of one of the ships that had made this day possible, an American sailor was writing a letter home. Somewhere in the water below, the shadows of destroyers moved across a bay that would, within his lifetime, become the harbor of a peaceful ally. Somewhere on a naval air station stateside, a young man who had once been fished from the sea by the submarine Finback was preparing to become a civilian again, headed home to Texas to marry a woman named Barbara. The war was over. The arithmetic of what had been accomplished is worth pausing on, because the arithmetic is what Chester Nimitz would have wanted us to remember, and not the myth. At Midway, the United States Navy had defeated a Japanese force nearly twice its size, sinking 4 fleet carriers and killing the veteran core of Japanese naval aviation, and had done so not through superior firepower, but through intelligence, preparation, and the moral courage of an admiral who backed a codebreaker against Washington. Through the island-hopping campaign, the war in the Pacific had been shortened by at least a year and probably more. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of American lives and vastly more Japanese lives were spared by the doctrine of bypass and isolation. Islands that would have consumed entire divisions in frontal assault were instead simply left to wither, their garrisons alive but useless, waiting for a war that never came to their beaches. And in the submarine campaign, we come to what may be the most staggering statistic of the entire Pacific War. American submarines represented less than 2% of the total personnel of the United States Navy. And yet, in 3.5 years, they sank more than half of all Japanese vessels lost in the war. They destroyed 60% of the Japanese merchant marine. They cut the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies to a trickle. They killed the ability of the Imperial Japanese Navy to sortie its own battle fleet. Less than 2% of the men, more than half the kill. There has never been another campaign like it in the history of naval warfare. There probably never will be another one. And Chester Nimitz, the reserveman from Fredericksburg, Texas, the submariner, the officer who was not the president's first choice, had made it happen. He was promoted to Fleet Admiral in December of 1944, one of only 4 men in the history of the United States Navy to hold that rank. Admiral Leahy, Admiral King, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, 4 and no more ever. He served as Chief of Naval Operations from 1945 to 1947. He oversaw the demobilization of the greatest fleet ever assembled and the transition of the Navy into the nuclear age. R. He accepted without complaint the political rough water of the post-war years when inter-service rivalries and shrinking budgets and the emerging Cold War created difficulties that no wartime experience could have prepared him for. He retired to a house in Berkeley, California, on the hills above the bay. He went for long walks. He grew roses. He kept up correspondence with old shipmates. R. He served as a goodwill ambassador for the United Nations, working on the seemingly hopeless question of Kashmir. He did not, unlike some of his contemporaries, sell his memoirs to the highest bidder. He did not, unlike others, run for office. He did not, unlike still others, become a talking head on television. He wrote quietly. He read history. He watched the ocean. He died on February 20th, 1966, at his home. He was 80 years old. R. His funeral was small by his own written request. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, in a plot he had chosen himself, a plot near the graves of Raymond Spruance and Richmond Kelly Turner and Charles Lockwood. The men he had chosen, the men who had chosen him, together in the ground as they had been together on the ocean. But there is one story left. One story that Nimitz himself carried patiently until the end of his life. One story that, in a small way, is the true measure of the man, because there was one hero of the Pacific War who never received his due. Joseph Rochefort, the lieutenant commander in the smoking jacket, the code breaker whose analysis at Station Hypo had made Midway possible. R. In the weeks after that battle, when Nimitz put Rochefort's name forward for the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest award the Navy can bestow, the Washington intervened. The Redmond brothers, who had run the rival code-breaking unit at OP-20G and who had been so publicly wrong about the target of the Japanese attack, could not tolerate seeing Rochefort honored for the analysis they had opposed. Or they pulled strings. They discredited him. They arranged in October of 1942 and reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The man who had won Midway was quietly buried in a Navy backwater. He served out the war with dignity. He retired. He raised a family. He rarely spoke about what he had done. R. Chester Nimitz submitted the Distinguished Service Medal recommendation for Rochefort more than once over the years. Each time, Washington rejected it. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976. He had never been decorated for Midway. In 1986, a decade after his death and 44 years after the battle, the President of the United States finally signed the papers. R. Ronald Reagan, in a ceremony at the White House, awarded Joseph Rochefort the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously. His family accepted them on his behalf. Somewhere, if the dead know such things, Chester Nimitz would have nodded once, patiently, and gone back to reading. As he said about so many things, that it had taken longer than it should have, but that it had been done. R. We remember Douglas MacArthur for the cork pipe and the sunglasses, and the promise kept. We remember George Patton for the pearl-handled revolvers and the theatrical rages and the tank columns roaring across France. We remember Bernard Montgomery for the beret and the Iron Certainty campaign. We remember them for style, for drama, for the size of the personality on the stage. Chester Nimitz did not have any of that. R. He never wanted any of that. He was an understated Texan with a slight German accent and a habit of listening more than he spoke. He was the kind of man who, if you passed him on a street corner in his civilian years, you would not have noticed at all. R. And in that restraint, in the discipline, in the judgment, in the willingness to trust the right people and back them against the world, he did something that none of the more famous men could have done. He won the largest naval war in the history of the human race, fought across 7,000 miles of water, involving thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of aircraft, and more than 2 million men. R. He won it not by outshouting his enemies, but by outthinking them. He won it not by seeking glory, but by refusing to be distracted by it. He won it by understanding from the day he stepped through the wreckage at Pearl Harbor that his job was not to be famous. His job was to bring his men home, and a great many of them did come home, and a great many others did not. R and Chester Nimitz carried both those numbers with him in the pockets of his mind for the rest of his life. So here is the question this story leaves behind. What makes a great commander? Is it the volume of voice, the size of the ego, the talent for the camera and the quotable line, or is it something rarer than that? Something we do not see as often as we should because it does not announce itself. The willingness to trust a subordinate against the institutional current. The discipline to make a calculated decision instead of a dramatic one. The steadiness in the darkest hour not to add your own panic to the general fire. The answer, if history teaches us anything, is that a nation at war needs all kinds of leaders. It needs the Pattons and the MacArthurs whose personalities can move mountains. But at the top, at the point where everything must be seen at once, and everything must be weighed at once, and everything must be decided at once, it needs a Nimitz. It needs the man who does not need the microphone. And America in the winter of 1941, on the day she needed him most, found him. Thank you for spending this time with the story of Chester W. Nimitz. Or if you had a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a brother who served in any war, in any branch, in any decade, tell us his name in the comments below, just his name, so that somewhere on this vast internet, in this corner of the world, we remember him together. That is what Nimitz would have wanted. Somewhere in history, there is another quiet man waiting to be remembered. We will find him together.